A young Wren kneels beside a steel cabinet the size of a wardrobe, feeding a loop of punched paper tape between two spoked wheels. It is just past 6 in the morning on 1st February 1944, inside Block F at Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, and the room hums with the low electrical drone of valves warming through. She checks her watch, flicks a switch, and the tape begins to run at 30 miles an hour, flashing past a photoelectric reader too fast for any human eye to follow. Lights flicker across a wall of dials, each one a tiny window into a calculation nobody in the room could perform by hand in a lifetime. Somewhere in the rack of wiring behind her, a machine with no name anyone outside this room is permitted to say. Aloud is comparing thousands of possible wheel settings a second, hunting for the pattern buried inside a message sent from German High Command. She does not know what the message will say. She knows only that whatever comes out of this machine in the next few hours may end up on a desk in front of Winston Churchill by nightfall, and that if she asks a single question about its contents, she will be removed from the building and never allowed back. The machine is called Colossus, and 8 months earlier, it did not exist anywhere in the world, not even as a finished drawing. To understand why a converted telephone workshop in northwest London produced the fastest calculating machine on Earth, you have to go back further still, to a single mistake made by one exhausted German radio operator on the night of the 30th of August, 1941. British listening stations at Knockholt in Kent, staffed eventually by around 600 interceptors, working teleprinters and undulators in shifts around the clock, had spent months logging a new kind of enemy signal. It was not Morse code, like the Enigma traffic Bletchley Park had already learned to read. It arrived as a continuous stream of teleprinter pulses, generated by a machine built by the Wrens company of Berlin, and formally designated the SZ40. Bletchley's Codebreakers named this traffic Tunny, one strand of a wider family they called Fish. Unlike Enigma, which carried tactical orders between field units, Tunny carried the direct communications of Adolf Hitler and his most senior generals, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. If Enigma was the coded chatter of the German war machine, Tunny was its brainstem, and for 2 years nobody at Bletchley Park had found a way in. On that August night, a German operator transmitted a message of nearly 4,000 characters, then received a request to resend it, likely because of a garbled reception. Correct procedure required him to reset his Wrens machine to a fresh key before sending again. Instead, tired or careless, he reset it to the same starting position as before, then retyped the message a second time, abbreviating a handful of words here and there to save his fingers. Both transmissions carried the identical 12-letter indicator, HQIBPEXEZMUG. Brigadier John Tiltman, one of Bletchley's most gifted codebreakers, recognised immediately what this meant. 2 messages sent in what cryptanalysts call a depth, encrypted with precisely the same key. By combining the 2 ciphertexts character by character and guessing that the first message began with the German word Spruchnummer, meaning message number, Tiltman spent 10 painstaking days reconstructing almost 4,000 characters of the underlying key stream by hand. He had broken into Tunny without ever seeing a Wrens machine, without knowing its wheel count, its wiring, or even its name. One tired operator's shortcut became the crack that the entire rest of the code-breaking effort was built through. The key stream Tiltman recovered still had to be explained mathematically before it could be predicted in advance, rather than merely reconstructed after the fact, message by message. That task fell to Bill Tutt, a 24-year-old chemistry and mathematics graduate from Trinity College, Cambridge, who had joined the research section in October 1941. Working for months with squared paper and a statistical method called Kasiski examination, testing repeating patterns in the recovered key against different possible wheel lengths, Tutt had deduced by January 1942 the entire logical structure of the Wrens machine. 12 wheels of varying sizes, arranged in a design he reconstructed purely from mathematics, having never once laid eyes on the physical device. It remains one of the most remarkable feats of pure deduction in the history of cryptanalysis anywhere in the world. Alan Turing, already well known within Bletchley Park for his work against Enigma, contributed a manual technique for finding wheel patterns that colleagues nicknamed Turingery in his honour. By July 1942, a new section called the Testery, under Major Ralph Tester, was reading current Tunny traffic for the first time, though agonizingly slowly, taking 4 to 6 weeks to fully decrypt a single message. By the time a decrypt was finished, the war it described had usually already moved on, and the intelligence inside it had curdled from urgent to merely historical. Max Newman, a Cambridge mathematician who had taught Turing before the war, was given the job of mechanizing the search to close that gap. In June 1943, he formed a small unit that became known as the Newmanry and, working from Tutter's mathematics, built a machine called Heath-Robinson, delivered that May, to automate parts of the wheel-setting search using electromechanical relays. It was unreliable, partly by accident and partly by the nature of its own design. 2 lengths of paper tape had to run in exact synchronization at high speed, side by side, and they stretched, slipped out of alignment, or simply tore apart under the strain. Newman brought in Tommy Flowers, a post office telephone engineer based at the Dollis Hill Research Station in northwest London, who had spent more than a decade building electronic telephone exchange equipment for the General Post Office. Flowers examined Heath-Robinson and concluded flatly, to Newman's frustration, that it would never work reliably enough to matter. His answer, radical for 1943, was to abandon the second paper tape entirely, store that data stream electronically inside the machine itself, and replace the slow electromechanical relay switches with thermionic valves, the same glass vacuum tubes found inside an ordinary domestic radio set. Flowers spent 11 months designing and building the machine, much of it on his own initiative, and partly at real personal financial risk, because his superiors at Bletchley Park remained openly sceptical that anything built from 1,500 valves could run continuously without at least one of them failing and silently corrupting the entire calculation. Valves had a long-standing reputation among engineers for unreliability. Flowers, however, had run valve-based telephone exchange equipment continuously for months at a stretch at Dollis Hill, and he knew from direct, repeated experience that valves failed almost exclusively at the moment of switching on or off, not while running steadily at a constant temperature. He built Colossus to stay powered permanently, day and night, precisely to avoid that specific failure point, a decision that struck many of his contemporaries as close to reckless. The finished machine, later known as Colossus Mark I, arrived at Bletchley Park in December 1943, was assembled on site by engineers Harry Fensham and Don Horwood, and was put to its first genuine operational job in February 1944, the same week that young Wren in Block F fed her first length of tape through its reader. The results were immediate and, to those who had spent 2 years fighting Tunney, by hand, almost unbelievable. Where Heath-Robinson had strained to keep pace with a single day's intercepted traffic, Colossus tore through 5,000 characters a second, testing thousands of possible wheel start positions in roughly the time it once took a human clerk to test one. 4 Mark II machines were ordered in March 1944, each built around 2,400 valves and running 5 times faster again than the original. Flowers later recalled being told plainly, without explanation, that if the new machines were not ready by 1st June 1944, they would be too late to be of any use whatsoever. Nobody at Dollis Hill or Bletchley told him why that particular date carried such weight. He simply understood, from the flat urgency in the instruction, that something enormous was coming, and he built accordingly, driving his small team through nights and weekends to meet a deadline they were never permitted to have explained to them. Colossus Mark II went into service on June 1st, 1944, 5 days before Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. German confidence in the Wrens machine, meanwhile, never wavered. Engineers at the Wrens Company in Berlin considered the SZ-40 and its successor, the SZ-42, mathematically unbreakable, and German signals officers used it precisely because it was reserved for the highest levels of command, the traffic they judged too important to risk on Enigma. That confidence was never seriously shaken for the rest of the war. No German officer ever learned that a British machine on the outskirts of a market town in Buckinghamshire was reading their most sensitive orders within hours of transmission. The security around Colossus at Bletchley Park was built to guarantee exactly that ignorance. Decrypts leaving Block F were rewritten, sanitized, and attributed to invented sources such as agents or aerial reconnaissance before they ever reached a field commander, a practice designed to protect the secret, even from the very officers who acted on the intelligence it contained. If a German unit had ever suspected its tunny link was compromised, the entire code-breaking effort, and everything built on top of it, would have collapsed overnight. If this deep dive into the machine that quietly read Hitler's mail is interesting to you, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. What the machine actually produced day after day was intelligence of a kind no army in history had previously possessed. Once Colossus found the wheel settings for a given day's tunny traffic, the testry's codebreakers decrypted the full message by hand and passed the result up the chain to military planners. In the weeks before D-Day, this traffic included direct exchanges between Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris and Hitler's Wolfslair command post at Rastenburg in East Prussia, laying out German assessments of where the coming invasion would actually land. Decrypts running through May 1944 showed that German high command still believed, partly because of the success of Allied deception operations running alongside this intelligence effort, that Normandy was a feint, and the true main assault would fall further along the coast at Calais. That single thread of certainty, drawn from a machine that had not existed as working hardware a mere 18 months earlier, directly shaped how many armoured divisions Field Marshal Rommel chose to keep in reserve at the very moment the invasion actually began on the Normandy beaches. This was not the only intelligence feeding into the Normandy planning, and Bletchley Park's leadership was always careful to weigh Colossus material alongside decrypted Enigma traffic, agent reports and aerial reconnaissance rather than trusting any single source in isolation. But Tunney carried something none of those other channels could match, the unfiltered thinking of Hitler and his immediate circle, days or even hours after it was spoken or dictated, rather than orders passed down and potentially altered at each level of command beneath them. The contrast between what was happening at Dollis Hill and what was happening on those invasion beaches is worth sitting with directly, side by side. On June 6, 1944, roughly 160,000 Allied troops came ashore into machine gun fire, mined beach obstacles and deliberately flooded fields, a campaign measured afterwards in yards of sand and hedgerow, taken at appalling human cost. 50 miles away, in a converted telephone research building, engineers in shirt sleeves adjusted racks of valves and traced faults on oscilloscopes, running calculations that helped commanders decide precisely where those 160,000 men should be sent next, and where the German reserves they would face were most likely concentrated. One battle was fought with rifles, tanks, and naval guns in the open air, under fire, in full view of the world. The other was fought with vacuum tubes and punched paper tape, inside a locked room that officially did not exist, watched by nobody but a handful of engineers, and Wrens sworn to total silence. Neither side of that equation could have worked as it did, without the other quietly supporting it. By the end of the war, 10 Colossus machines were installed and running continuously at Bletchley Park, operated around the clock in 3 rotating shifts by a combined staff of 550 people, the overwhelming majority of them women serving with the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens. They fed tapes through the readers, monitored for valve failures, reset wheel position counters between runs, and maintained the machines under strict compartmentalized secrecy that prevented almost anyone from understanding the full picture of what they were part of. Between them, across the war, the Colossus machines decrypted 63 million characters of high-grade German communications. Each individual operator typically understood only the narrow mechanical task directly in front of her on a given shift. Almost none knew what the decrypted messages said, who exactly had sent them, or what became of the intelligence once it left the room in a sealed folder. A Wren who spent 18 months feeding tape through a Colossus reader might, in many documented cases, never learn that her nightly shift work had touched the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander himself. Secrecy around Colossus did not end when the war did, and this is where the story takes its sharpest turn, where captured German Enigma machines eventually found their way into museums and even private collections after the war. Every single Colossus machine still standing in Britain was deliberately dismantled after 1945. On instructions traced back to Winston Churchill personally, its parts scattered, melted down, or simply destroyed, and the surviving engineers and Wrens who had built and operated them were bound to permanent silence under the Official Secrets Act. Tommy Flowers, the man who had personally designed and built the fastest computing machine on the planet in 1943, working largely on his own judgment against official skepticism, was denied any public credit for over 30 years. When he later applied for a bank loan to fund a post-war engineering project of his own, he could not explain what his most significant wartime work had actually involved, because it remained officially classified information, and the loan application was refused outright. He died in 1998, having lived to see only partial, belated recognition of what he had actually achieved during those 11 months at Dollis Hill. The full technical story of Colossus was not declassified by the British government until the 1970s, with detailed engineering accounts continuing to emerge as late as the 2000s, by which point Flowers had missed almost his entire adult lifetime of acknowledgement for the machine now credited to him. It took a further act of dedicated, unpaid reconstruction to make the machine visible again at all. In the 1990s, a team led by the computer conservationist Tony Sale set out to rebuild a working Colossus from scratch, working only from a handful of surviving wartime photographs, fragments of circuit diagrams, and the recollections of the few original engineers still alive to consult. The rebuild took the best part of 14 years, and the finished machine, standing today at the National Museum of Computing on the Bletchley Park site, was declared complete in 2007, 63 years after the original Mark II first went to work ahead of D-Day. It runs on the same principles Flowers worked out under pressure at Dollis Hill, valve by valve, and it remains the clearest physical evidence anywhere in the world of what that small, secretive room actually built. The realization of what Colossus actually represented took decades to catch up with the machine itself. Historians of computing now widely recognize it as the world's first large-scale, programmable electronic digital computer, working reliably from December 1943 onward, a full 2 years before the American ENIAC machine, that was for decades popularly credited with that same title in the absence of any public knowledge of Colossus's existence. It achieved this not through any deliberate act of invention or ambition to build a computer, but as an emergency wartime tool constructed to solve one specific, narrow problem: finding the wheel settings of a single German cipher machine, fast enough for the resulting intelligence to still matter operationally. Nobody involved in its construction set out to invent the computer age. They set out to read Hitler's mail before the information inside it went stale. And in doing so, they quietly built something that would go on to reshape the entire 20th century, decades before most of the world had any idea Colossus had ever existed. The intelligence Colossus produced is credited today by both the National Museum of Computing and by Bletchley Park's own official historians, with shortening the war in Europe by many months, sparing an estimated tens of thousands of Allied lives that would otherwise have been spent finding out by force, on the ground, what the machines in Block F had already quietly read on paper tape weeks or even months earlier. That is a careful, evidence-based claim, grounded in specific surviving decrypts and specific documented decisions taken by specific commanders in the tense weeks surrounding D-Day, not a vague figure rounded up for dramatic effect. Back in Block F, that February morning in 1944, the young Wren watches her tape run to its end and begins spooling a fresh reel onto the machine without pausing to rest her hands. She has no way of knowing that the device beside her will one day be called the direct ancestor of every computer that follows it, and no way of knowing that her own name will almost certainly never appear in any published account of what happened inside this room. She simply logs the runtime in a ledger, resets the wheel start counters back to 0, and threads the next length of tape carefully through the reader, because there is another message waiting somewhere out on the ether, sent from Rastenburg or Paris or somewhere closer still to the coast, and down the chain of command a British general needs to know what it says before the war moves on without him.